I want to thank Sharon for the coffee and Alan. Okay, and also, I'm not sure who bought donuts today. Okay, it was Mr. Eldon. Thank you, Eldon, for the donuts. I hope you got a chocolate old-fashioned, but I think he did. But want to appreciate you doing that for us today. And with that, let's just put my coffee down and get going here, huh? The overview of our study, of course, is what God is doing to essentially undo all the problems that we brought into the world when we sinned against him, and how he has a plan, a purpose that spans through all of time. We've been talking particularly in this aspect of the lesson about bodily resurrection, and at great length we have talked about that. And we're at the question now, well, okay, we understand what's going to happen to our bodies, that our bodies, when they die, they are disposed of in one way or another, perhaps depending on the time in which we live or the culture in which we live, and they await resurrection into glorified bodies that are fit for eternity. But since we are made up both of spirit and body, the question we've been dealing with last week and this week is, what happens to our spirit? And we've kind of a phrase that's used to talk about this sort of time in our existence is the intermediate state. Intermediate in that it's between our physical death and our resurrection at the return of Jesus. And so we looked at some passages last week in Luke 23. Jesus tells the thief on the cross, "Today you will be with me in paradise." That this is a place of, the word paradise conjures up by its very meaning this place of fellowship and of beauty and of peace. And it's actually the Greek word that's used in the Greek version of the Old Testament to speak about Eden, kind of almost like this pre-fall kind of situation where we're kind of have a beautiful, peaceful time of fellowship, in this case with Jesus. In Luke 16, we read about the rich man and Lazarus and how they're at death. These two men, though their bodies have been buried, they're very much alive, and they're very conscious, and they find themselves in two different realms, one being punished, one being blessed, the Lazarus, the poor man, at Abraham's side, a place of fellowship, a place of belonging. And we just kind of have pointed out through these passages that there is individual identity. The same identity that we have now continues even in this time when our spirits and our bodies are separated. We read from Matthew 17, the transfiguration, where Jesus appears with Moses and Elijah, two men from the Old Testament who are who are present and are somehow, and we're not told how, but are somehow recognizable to Peter, James, and John, the three apostles who are with Jesus on the mountain. But they are still Moses and Elijah. They are still those same people, and they continue to exist. We come to one more passage before we kind of go to the central passage on this, and that's Acts chapter 2. Acts chapter 2, of course, is Peter's great sermon on Pentecost. And in the sermon, he quotes from Psalm 16, verses 8 through 11, to speak about Jesus. Here's the quote from Acts 2:27. He's quoting David from Psalm 16, where David said, "You will not abandon my soul to Hades or let your Holy One see corruption." We've read this passage before because it points to the resurrection of Jesus, that Jesus' body is not going to be left in the grave. And so in the sermon, Peter makes it clear, hey, David's tomb is right over there, and he is in the grave. So when David was saying these words, he was saying them prophetically about the Messiah who was to come, and that Messiah is Jesus. And he quotes this as kind of a biblical prophecy that the Messiah would be raised. And of course, in Acts 2, he is proclaiming Jesus to have been raised from the dead. We don't normally look to poetry to define doctrine. The purpose of poetry in the Old Testament is not necessarily to lay out theological doctrine and organized teachings. However, we have the aid of the Holy Spirit and the Apostle Peter to take this passage, this part of a poem, and make a very clear and certain application of that statement to Jesus. And so, when you hear this statement, how would you interpret this or explain this in reference to Jesus? For you will not abandon my soul to Hades or let your Holy One see corruption. What does that mean? What's that actually say? Yes, Robin?
Well, his body would not decay.
Okay.
So have to be resurrected.
Yeah, there must be a resurrection, because his body is not going to see corruption. His body is not going to stay in the grave and deteriorate and go back to the dust, as is typical. And that's, of course, Peter is latching onto that phrase and tying it directly into the resurrection of Jesus. What else does it say? There's 2 lines in the verse, aren't there? That's the second line. What's the first line? Okay, and if he's speaking here about Jesus, yes.
The soul is not going to just be abandoned. In other words, something's happening to the soul right after he dies. It's not going to be left somewhere in the netherworld or whatever. It's not going to be left to Hades.
Okay.
Which is what they call Sheol, is that?
Yeah, the word Hades, it brings up a very interesting discussion about the words used both in the Hebrew Old Testament and the Greek New Testament about the realm of the dead. 90% of the time, I think, in the New Testament, Hades is used just to speak of the realm of the dead. There are a couple of times, however, when Hades is spoken of with a view more toward torment. For example, the rich man lifted up his eyes in Hades, being in torment. And so there the word isn't just being used in a general sense. Because in the general sense, both the rich man and Lazarus are in Hades. In a general sense, because the word Hades in Greek just means the place of the realm of the dead, or the place of the dead, and that's a kind of the general use. But Donna says that in terms of the soul of Jesus, his soul will not be abandoned to Hades. It's just not going off to be never heard of or seen again. But it does kind of raise the question, and we've already, I think the other texts that we've read have already answered it. What happens to Jesus's body and to Jesus's soul or spirit when he dies? From the passages that we've just read, what happened to Jesus?
Well, it's the great divorce. His body and spirit separate.
Okay, the great divorce. His body and spirit separate, and what happens to them? Or, yes?
Well, his spirit goes to paradise.
His spirit goes to paradise. Isn't that what he said? Today you'll be with me in paradise. So he himself answers the question. And what happens to his body? Well, it goes into the grave, right? What happens on the first day of the week?
It comes back. It's resurrected.
Okay, his body is resurrected. What about the other part? Because we're saying that in his death, his body has gone one place in the tomb, and his soul, his spirit, has gone to paradise, or generally speaking, to Hades, to the realm of the dead. What happens on Sunday morning?
Spirit comes back to the body.
Yes, there is a coming back together. The spirit, the soul, the spirit, and the body come back together in resurrection. And in that moment, this verse is fulfilled. God did not abandon his soul to the realm of the dead, and God did not allow the Holy One, and in this case speaking of his body, to see corruption. And that's exactly what happens to Jesus. Yes?
Just a little side question. At the very end, he says, into your hands I commend my spirit, Father. So the spirit goes to God, but he's going to say, you're going to be with me in paradise. So I'm assuming God is also in the paradise realm or something where they see God, I guess, but not heaven yet. But is that, what am I saying?
It's kind of dangerous when somebody says something and then they ask you what are they saying. I think one way to answer that is if in the case of Luke 23, if Jesus is there, God is there. There are some things that I'm trying to think of actual specific, like where we're specifically told something, and we're going to get to something in just a moment. Yes, go ahead.
I just thought of maybe an answer.
Oh, good.
He's going to commend his spirit to God. That doesn't necessarily mean God's in paradise with, he's just commending it to okay, God, take care of my spirit, do what you want with it.
Sure, and when I think we all understand that when we get all done with this class, hopefully before the end of the year, I hope that would be awesome. That there's a lot of mystery. We're just beginning to touch the hem of the garment of mystery. When we start to get to the next stage, that's where we're really, I think, we're gonna enter a realm of exploring that perhaps we may not have fully explored before. So I think there's going to be mystery. And so we're Western. We talked about this from the get-go in this class. We want the details. We want the facts. We want everything. It's how we're wired, and we want to know, and there's nothing wrong with that. And so then we begin to think, okay, is there a passage that says God the Father is in paradise? And so we're trying to look for that. And I think as there are a couple of texts that we'll move through. Certainly, to be absent from the body is to be present with the Lord, Paul will say, and that's our last passage, I think, in the handout here. So then how do you define the Lord? Is that the Lord Jesus? Is that including God? Paul talks about going to paradise in 2 Corinthians, into the realm of God. It's like, so I mean, there's a little mystery there. I certainly would not say categorically God cannot be there by any means, but I think some of it's a kind of weighing these texts and taking a look at them.
We're trying to be Nicodemus.
Yeah, we're trying to. Well, we want to know the details, of course. I think the takeaway for me is when we continually come across the word of first fruits for Jesus, that what happens to Jesus happens to us. I think we've all seen that from 1 Corinthians 15. Whatever happens to Jesus is going to happen to us. So what's going to happen to us when we die? I think that we're going to go to the passage that lays it out in a little bit more detail, but I think this gives us a pretty good starting point. And it strikes me so often. You can kind of just take this whole thing on as sort of this philosophical discussion, but the reality that I hope is that we're all, of course, aware of. We're not just speaking here about theoretical, abstract things that have nothing to do with us. What we're describing in these texts is the experience that awaits us. We're talking about ourselves here, aren't we? I mean, I really care what happens to you. I really do. But can I just be really honest and say, I'm really concerned what happens to me? And I'm saying that in a joking way, because it's the same thing. It's the same thing for all of us. But I think it's like, I want to know, do you not want to? Of course we want to have this is a big deal, because it's going to happen. I remember I was probably about 11 or 12 when it hit me that I was actually going to die, that I wasn't the one person that I thought I was that would escape physical death. I always thought that was for everybody else except for me. But and the Lord may come and keep that eventuality at bay. I don't know. But then when it struck me that it's if the Lord doesn't return, that's happening to me, and there's no way out of it. I kind of want to know what happens. I kind of have a vested interest in this study. I think we all do. So what happened to Jesus? His spirit, as Donna said, he committed to the Father and was in paradise. We understand that word paradise in Abraham's side, that these are word pictures, but they're word pictures that carry substance with them. They're fellowship, they're reunion, there's beauty, there's peace. His body went into the grave. And then what happened? Well, Jesus was raised from the dead. And what happened when he was raised from the dead? His spirit and his body came together, and his body was changed. And I think what we've been looking at in 1 Corinthians 15 for quite some time is that very same conclusion. That's what's going to happen to us. Our bodies are going to go into a grave, or in some way be dealt with according to however that is. And our spirits will if we take literally what it said in Luke 16, the angels are going to carry us into the presence, into paradise, to Abraham's side. And then when the Lord returns, our bodies are going to be raised, and our spirits will be reunited with bodies that are now fit for eternity and glorified. And our lowly bodies will be like his glorious body, and then we'll be ready for eternity in the presence of God. And so that would certainly seem, I think if we just kind of taking that away from Jesus's experience, that would certainly seem to be what's being said. Anything before we go on now to kind of the main text? Yes?
Isn't there a difference between burial and cremation today we have? So it's not like Jesus. Jesus was just buried.
That's right. There is a difference between burial and cremation. In the long run, I would say cremation just speeds up the process, because if you are not cremated, you will eventually return to dust. The body returns to dust. Our bodies are made out of, from the biblical perspective, are made out of the dust, and they return to the dust and will be raised up out of the dust. But they will be raised up, transformed and renewed and glorified. Yes?
And is there also a difference between ashes and dust?
Mm-hmm. Sure, but I think to bring this down on that, and I'm not the person with the credentials to do this, but to bring this down to like the molecular level or the atomic level, matter can't be destroyed or created. So whatever happens to our bodies, whatever change happens to the matter that was once our body, however it's changed, whatever pressures or whatever are brought against it, the elements from which we are made never cease to exist. And we're leaving it in the hands of God and in the might of God to bring resurrected bodies, to bring new bodies out of the old elements from which the present bodies have been made. I know we're jumping in at the end of something. We spent a long time talking about bodily resurrection, especially in 1 Corinthians 15. But I appreciate your questions, Mike and then Alan.
The important thing here is that what happens to our spirit. God's going to work out the body thing. But when we die, our spirit is going to paradise.
Yes. And what Mike said, I like the way you put it that way, because ultimately it does matter what happens to our body, but as you said, God will work that out. God has the wisdom as creator to work out resurrection. But in terms of our own consciousness and our own identity and awareness, we have great assurances of what's going to happen. when we close our eyes in death and are ushered into the presence of the Lord. Alan and Eldon.
I would say, I thought about this. I had the same question you had for a long time as growing up. It's like, well, what does happen to the body? I mean, what happens if you're cremated? What happens if you're lost at sea? What happens if you're in outer space and you die on the moon? Well, we can't. I think the most important thing is you can't limit the power of God.
Right.
God can do anything at any time, and He can take the ashes or the dust or whatever you want to call it, and He can make it into a jigsaw puzzle. But He's very good at jigsaw puzzles. He can put them together instantly. He can put them back together. And like I said, I think the most important thing is please don't limit the power of God. God can do anything.
And I think we've mentioned this many times on that subject. But when Jesus is talking to the Sadducees who denied the resurrection, first of all, he said, you don't know the scriptures. But then he said, you don't know the power of God. We believe from Genesis that God created us from the dust of the earth. That's our faith. We believe that God can do that. If we believe God can do that, God can raise up from anything that's left of us whatever He desires to raise up. God's power cannot be limited here. He's sovereign. And it just, I mean, if He states that, if He says that's what He's going to do, then I think we accept that that's what He's going to do. Eldon?
Well, I was just going to bring up what is just said about the power of God. The Corinthians, they just couldn't fathom how this could be possible. And Jesus gave them, of course, the answer. The power of God makes it possible.
Right, and for the Corinthians too, not only was it that they didn't understand how it was possible, they didn't understand why it was desirable. They didn't understand the eternal purpose of God enough to understand why it had to be. And that's, I think, one of the things we've tried to show in 1 Corinthians. If there is no bodily resurrection, there's no victory over sin and death. This has to be. It's not just a frivolous thing. It's part of the eternal purpose of God to reclaim creation that is destroyed by sin in the first place. Ellen?
I don't know how to form what is going on in my head, but the truth is that when a person dies, no matter what their body turns into, if it's ashes, if it's dust, if it's dung on the bottom of the sea, it is still a person in that realm, whatever it is, whatever our bodies deteriorate into. That I don't think DNA is the right word, but I don't know scientifically what the word is. But we are still in that. We are still that dust. We are still those ashes. We are still that whatever has happened to us, and that is what God takes and changes back into a body.
Right, and it's just impossible for us to understand that, and because of the power that's it. And I think, along with what Ellen's saying, and this is saying the same thing with slightly different words, is the matter that makes up your body right now, the very things that we are made up in terms of the elements of the physical material realm, those things cannot be destroyed in this physical realm. Matter does not get destroyed. It changes. It can change into something else. It can change into a gas. It can change into a liquid. It can change the molecular breakdown and all of that. All of that can happen. But the very things that make us, that make up, honestly, that make up anything in the physical creation, it changes form, but the matter itself is indestructible in this realm. And so what we're claiming, or what we're saying that God is claiming, I mean, that's where the Greek thinking was, but it's like, no, the body dies because of sin, And if God is going to conquer sin and death, the body must be raised incorruptible. And then 1 Corinthians 15, that's when it's in the resurrection that the last enemy, death, is destroyed. Death isn't destroyed because Jesus comes back and nobody dies anymore. Death is destroyed because bodies come up out of the graves. That's how death gets destroyed. And so apart from that, the enemy's never destroyed. So, I mean, this is getting into this like very deep, eternal purpose of God to recreate in some sense and renew all creation. And we're not even there yet. We're talking about all creation. That's the next class. It's so much bigger than my body or yours. It's all creation renewed. Think about that. That's as you know, if you've been looking at that 6-point chart for the last 6 years, you know that the next one's down is renewed creation, and we're going to get there. Okay, 2 Corinthians. There may be more to talk about that, but right now we need to introduce this text in 2 Corinthians chapter 5. And can I just say that just be patient with the Apostle Paul. And what I mean by that, sometimes as Paul talks, we have to really stop and listen and think and go back over what he's saying. Because there are times when I read Paul and I think, why don't you just come out and say it this way? And then I would know. But Paul has a way of saying things, sometimes using imagery that might be a little bit foreign to us, but it's worth the work to think through and just give your mind over to what Paul says here. I'm not saying it's confusing, but we want things just stated factually, and this is pretty close. But the text is 2 Corinthians chapter 5. We're going to look at verses 1 through 10. And I think for context purposes, just glance back at verses 16 to 18. He's talking about how the outer self is wasting away. Our inner self is being renewed. This light momentary affliction is preparing for us an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison as we look not to the things that are seen, but to the things that are unseen. For the things that are seen are transient, but the things that are unseen are eternal. For we know. Okay, see, this is picking up. Sometimes at a chapter break, we just think Paul is continuing with what he's talking about, with these realms, the realm before that's temporary, the realm that's coming that's permanent. And so let's take a look at, in verses 1 through 5, where Paul says, for we know that if the tent that is our earthly home is destroyed, we have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. For in this tent we groan, longing to put on our heavenly dwelling, if indeed by putting it on we may not be found naked. For while we are still in this tent, we groan, being burdened, not that we would be unclothed, but that we would be further clothed, so that what is mortal may be swallowed up by life. He who has prepared us for this one is more permanent.
Weak.
What's that? One is weak, one is stronger. Okay, so you can begin to see here the contrast that's going on between a tent and a building. And
You
one
can take with you one you can take with you when you go
you can fold up your tent.
on.
But we find out that our tent's going to be destroyed. We got a tent that's going to be destroyed. That's what verse 1 says, right? We know that if the tent that is our earthly home is destroyed, we have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. Now, I want to forestall something here, because remember 1 Corinthians 15. Anything that Paul says here has to fit with and complement 1 Corinthians 15. He's been incredibly clear about the resurrected body and transformation. But here he uses words in a different way just to help us understand something. Because he talks about a house, a building not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. And so he's stressing here a body that is made by God, a body that is eternal. Now, I think it's important for us to note, as we compare this to 1 Corinthians 15, he's talking about the resurrected body. This isn't something different than that. It's not like, so there is a body. No, what he's talking about needs to fit here. Now, what's all this talk about being clothed and unclothed and being found naked and all this stuff? What's his metaphor? What's his analogy or his illustration? What's he saying here? In this tent we groan, longing to put on our heavenly dwelling, if indeed by putting it on we may not be found naked. For while we are still in this tent we groan, being burdened, not that we would be unclothed, but that we would be further clothed, so that what is mortal may be swallowed up by life. What's all this talk about tents and buildings and clothing and nakedness? Donna?
The spirit will not be disembodied as an eventual happening. We'll have a body of some sort, not just going around.
Okay, so you're saying when he's speaking about being unclothed, he's speaking of what?
Not having anything for the spirit to inhabit.
Okay, being unclothed is the spirit has nothing to inhabit. The spirit has no body. Okay, exactly. And Paul's saying in this body we groan. And then he says it's not that we want to be unclothed. What does that mean? When he says we don't want to be unclothed, but we want to be further clothed.
I don't want to die.
Okay, you don't want to die. Robin?
We want some type of body to house our spirit.
Yeah.
And I'm sitting here thinking I don't want to do.
Well, what I'm going to take away from that is that spirits, even evil ones, sometimes like to inhabit bodies. Yeah, well, we will not be going into demonology, however. That's next quarter. We'll get somebody to teach that one. But it's like we're created in such a way that, I mean, even though that we have that Greek thing that comes into our Western worldview about being disembodied spirits, there's a part, I don't want to be floating around on some cloud forever without sort of some substance or form. It's like we're created to be inside of a body and to be able to act and to move and to have some sort of substance. We're created to have substance. And so as we look to our death coming, it's not like what we're really shooting for here is to get out of our bodies and never be in a body again. That's not our dream. Our hope is not to be disembodied, because by very nature we want to be in a body. That's how we live. That's the only way that as human beings we know to live. And so we don't want to be naked, but we want to be further clothed. And so I think if you put that into what we've talked about, and I'll kind of summarize very briefly, and then we'll pick up here next week, as Paul is saying, look, when we die, we recognize that our spirits leave our bodies. And our spirits, in that sense, if you think of your body as a tent, our spirits are unclothed. But that's not really what we long for. What we long for is to be clothed again. What we long for is a body that won't wear out. What we long for is an eternal body that God gives to us. And then, notice what he says, then what is mortal may be swallowed up by what is life. That thought is right out of 1 Corinthians 15. When we're raised from the dead, this mortal has put on immortality. That which is mortal is swallowed up by life in the resurrection when our bodies are raised and transformed and changed. So Paul is saying here that in this, as we live on the earth, we live in a transitory body that we know is destined for death and for decay. And we groan because we don't want, that's not a good outcome. That's not a good eternal outcome for us. And it's not that we just want to be done with our body, but rather we don't want to stay unclothed forever, but rather we want to be clothed with a body that's like an eternal building. We want something that's substance, that will never die, that will never wear out, that we will be further clothed by God. And then at that time, what was once mortal will now be raised and will be swallowed up by immortality. We'll leave it at that, picking up at verses 6 through 10, and then in our next class we'll be moving into the renewal of all things. So really look forward to that, and thank you so much.